So first off, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us this morning for this panel entitled, What is it like to be a service member in the modern world? My name is Jessica Smeeks. I'm a visiting assistant professor at SUNY New Paltz. I will be serving as your moderator today. My specialty within anthropology is archaeology, and I work in South Central Peru on the period before the rise of the Inca Empire, which is about the 11th century. And my research focuses on the interrelationship between warfare and socio-political organization. Today, I am joined by 8 service members representing 4 branches of the United States military. They have graciously dedicated their time to provide personal insights on the practical experiences, intersecting identities, and interpersonal relationships associated with modern military life. Before I let the panelists individually introduce themselves, I want to take a moment to thank the Faculty Development Center and the Anthropology Department for sponsoring this event. More significantly, I want to thank the Office of Veteran and Military Services at SUNY New Paltz and its director, Jason F. Gilliland. Director Gilliland, his office, and the student veterans around campus have been invaluable resources in developing and organizing this event. The Office of Veteran and Military Services does an incredible job supporting and guiding our military service members, veterans, and dependents, and raising public awareness on and off campus. 3 of our panelists are New Paltz alumni, and I imagine they can attest to the amazing things this office does for our students. Thank you so much for your dedication and hard work. Turning back to the panelists, I would like each panelist to take a minute to introduce themselves. Please share your name, rank or rate, military branch, and current and former military occupation. And we'll start with Major Khan.
Hey, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, appreciate you having me. Super excited to be back in the New Paltz arena. I'm one of the New Paltz alumni, so always a great time to come back to New York virtually. I live in DC, so it's not too far. But as Jessica said, my name is Salim Khan. I'm an active duty Army officer. I've been in the Army for about 23 years. I've kind of spanned the gamut in terms of what I've done. I've been an infantryman. I was a longtime infantryman. Became a logistics officer, and now I'm an Army acquisition officer. So, looking forward to it. I've been to Iraq once and Afghanistan twice for a little bit of context, and I'm also married to another Army officer.
Thank you. Major Scott?
Turn my video here.
Yes.
Oh, all right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Professor Smeeks, for the invite. Trenton, thank you for the invite. So I'm Major Alicia Scott. I'm actually stationed here in Fort Stewart, Georgia, Hunter Army Airfield. It's home of the 3rd Infantry Division, and I have about 20 years of service, and I'm currently an acquisition officer, but prior to that, I was a human resources officer, and I'm happy to be here. I look forward to the questions.
Thank you. Captain Hanefen?
Thank you, Professor Smeeks. My name is Trenton Hanefen. I'm a SUNY New Paltz alum, graduated with a degree in history in 2011. I commissioned from SUNY New Paltz, I think one of the only cadets to graduate in quite a while sometimes. And then I was AG, the same branch as Major Scott. In fact, she was my commander at the captain's career course. But was branch detailed field artillery. So I started my military career in Germany as a field artillery officer, deployed to Afghanistan once. Yeah, and I think that covers it. Thank you.
Thank you. Command Sergeant Major Cleveland?
Good morning, Professor Smeeks. Thanks for putting this together. This is such a great opportunity. So I'm Command Sergeant Major Stephanie Cleveland. I am currently the Garrison Command Sergeant Major for Natick Soldier Systems Center outside of Boston, Massachusetts, which is where all of the uniforms and such for the entire Department of Defense are actually researched and developed. I've been in the Army for going on 23 years now. I have been a public affairs soldier the entire time I've been in the Army. I have about 6.5 month deployment to Kuwait pre 9/11. And I have 3 year-long deployments to Afghanistan, and I'm happy to be here. So thank you again.
Thank you. Petty Officer First Class Fries Bogart?
Hi, I'm Justin Freese Bogart. I just finished up my 9 years in the Navy 3 days ago. Very happy to be here. Happy to finish up my time. I was a nuke electrician on Virginia-class submarines up here in Groton, Connecticut, which is where I currently live. I just started my civilian job in the middle of March as the training analyst, which I got a lot of that experience from the Navy. And I'm happy to be here. Thanks.
Thank you. Sergeant Shaw.
Yeah, good morning, everyone, and thanks for having me on. It's an absolute pleasure. I'm thrilled to be here and looking forward to the conversation. I'm Aaron Shaw. While in the Marine Corps from 2005 to 2014, I made it to the rank of Sergeant or E5. While with the Marine Corps, I was given the job of ground electronics maintenance, but in true Marine Corps fashion, did little to none of that throughout my 2 deployments to Iraq. And I'm not sore about it. It's not a bad thing. I'm currently over at the University at Buffalo, working in admissions for the School of Management at the graduate programs level. And again, looking forward to the conversation. Can't wait.
Thank you. Senior Airman Briggs.
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today. Looking forward to the conversation as well. My name is Nathan Briggs. I'm the Community Program Director for the Northeast Community Center in Millerton, New York. Graduate of New Paltz, class of 2004 in adolescence education for English. I served in the 105th Airlift Wing for the New York State Air National Guard, based at Stewart Air National Guard Base down in Newburgh. I was a senior airman E4, and I was a crew chief for the C5A Galaxy.
Thank you. Corporal James.
Sorry about that. My name is Corporal Dexter James, United States Army. I was a 14 Romeo, which is a Bradley linebacker crew member in Air Defense Artillery. Currently, I'm an adjunct professor at Monroe College in the Arts and Science department. And I'm just happy to be here and glad my wife, who's a SUNY New Paltz student, convinced me to do this.
Thank you very much. Thank you all, in fact, for taking your time out of your busy schedules to join us today and tell you a little bit about your experiences. For the remainder of this event, our panelists will be answering a series of questions about their military experiences. Out of respect for their experiences, this panel will not include an open question and answer section at the end. That's also why there's not a chat available in this current Zoom meeting. Shall we begin? We're going to start with some of the practical experiences. The instant an individual puts on the uniform, they are trained to operate within the chain of command. This chain of command includes junior enlisted, junior and senior NCOs, and officers. Could you provide an example of how this command structure affected or affects your day-to-day life in the military? Major Scott?
Okay, yes, sorry, here I go. So the chain of command is certainly required to lead an organization such as the Army. So, you know, we're required to support and defend the Constitution. We live by the Army values, and we're all governed by the Uniform Code of Military Justice. So a chain of command affects a soldier's day-to-day life every day. And so as a commander, commanders are responsible for the health and safety and well-being of their soldiers. So basically on a day-to-day basis, you're going to be checking in with your leadership. And at times, you know, sometimes soldiers have actually accountability formations where you're going to come in and we're going to la-di-da-di check everybody. I need to see your face. As you become senior, you know, it may become a little more subtle, maybe a phone call, maybe just coming in and into the office. But the commanders are responsible for your health and safety and making sure that you're alive and well. And so secondly, I think sometimes, you know, the chain of command, I think we all get it, but sometimes it can be a little challenging. So for example, if, you know, a traditional civilian, if you want to go visit Australia, you could just do so, right? You could just say, hey, I'm off work tomorrow and I'm flying to Australia. That's too easy, right? For us, it's not going to quite work like that. So because we have a chain of command, it's going to be different steps and different echelons. And so if you want to go to Australia, you might want to put that submission packet in for about 45 days, right? So, you know, your battalion commander, your company commander, your brigade commander may need to even sign off on it. So I don't just have the freedom and liberty to just kind of go where I want to. And so I think after you go through basic training and you start to live the Army values and you get it, I think after a while you just kind of, you know, the standards and you know the expectations. So you're going to want to do the right thing. You're going to want to be at the right place in the right time. And quite frankly, you have to, and you're going to want to. And so that's all I have, Professor, for this question.
Thank you. Command Sergeant Major Cleveland.
Yes, ma'am. Major Scott, I think you touched on some really interesting points there. And I think it's interesting when we look at chain of command. So as an enlisted soldier, I am actually not part of the chain of command traditionally. I'm part of what's called the chain of responsibility. So commanders, the commissioned officers, they are traditionally responsible for and accountable for everything that goes well and every failure of an organization. As an NCO, as a senior NCO, I'm responsible for advising that commander because oftentimes I have more experience than my commander might. I typically tend to have more time in service than the commander I'm assigned alongside of. And so it's my responsibility to make sure I am advising that commander along the way of what the best decision is for them to make. I'm also responsible then for communicating that commander's intent and that commander's expectations down through the subordinate levels. And so ultimately, I may not always agree with what my commander decides, but it's not up to me to agree. It's up to me to make sure it happens. As long as it's legal, moral, and ethical, we have to execute. And I think one of the things Major Scott mentioned that's really something a lot of people don't understand about the military is that we give up a lot of our freedoms when we join the military because we are supporting the Constitution. And there's certain things that we have to recognize that we just can't do that our civilian counterparts might be able to do. And that's really in the interest of maintaining the standards and discipline of the armed forces so that we can objectively defend the Constitution and support the American people.
Thank you. Petty Officer Fries-Bogart.
Yeah, I think they both bring up really great points. I'm from a submarine world. We generally have a lot tighter knit community. Without stepping too far into the next question, we definitely have a chain of command, and we, especially in an operations standpoint, I worked on the electric plant of a nuclear submarine, and some of those things are very timely matters, and you have generally a lower ranking officer right behind you as the person watching everything you do and giving you permission to do everything that you have to do. And if you have to listen to them, but sometimes you are the expert on what you're dealing with, which is what Stephanie just brought up. And they still have to back you, and they are still the ultimate responsible party, but you are generally the expert. So a good level of communication between that chain of command is really important. And then on a submarine, you have only a few high-ranking officers, and really not many officers at all compared to the enlisted amount of people. So it's really relying on them to guide the entire sub and keep you all safe.
Moving on, Corporal James, same question.
I can agree with what was put forth by the Command Sergeant Major and the officers, and also, I guess, Senior Petty Officer. But one interesting point that they didn't break up is also that the commanding officers and non-commissioned officers also have a responsibility to the lower enlisted. One prime example would be like health and welfare things. I could give one that comes off the top of my head. One of my fellow soldiers was basically having a simple thing with trying to get services for his special needs child. And through that, talking to his non-commissioned officer, his first line sergeant, and all the way up through the captain, they helped to facilitate and got access within the community to get help for it. So it's kind of a unique blend. Yes, you have this overall command structure, but at the same time, a lot of times NCOs and officers as well, up to the captain level, because usually majors and higher deal with upper level kind of problems and issues, get a lot involved in soldiers' health and welfare, and also kind of acting as an advocate to the outside world when there's problems for those soldiers, which is an interesting point you don't see in the civilian world.
Thank you. So sort of jumping off of what we've already been talking about, there are some growing misconceptions about the realities of the divide between enlisted and officers. Can you speak on those misconceptions? And since you brought it up, do you want to start, Petty Officer Friesbogart?
Sure. I think I have a unique experience from being on a submarine where it's about 130 people and about 30 or less than that is officers. So we're really kind of a family down there. I know like we just lost a sub, Indonesian sub, and lots of different thoughts and emotions about that going on right now in the sub community. But I mean, on almost a weekly basis, I would play cribbage or spades with my CO, who's an 05, even when I was an E4. So Petty Officer First Class for the Navy is E6, but all through those ranks, you're playing games to pass the time and you're doing different things like that. So I think it's a little different, whereas other nuclear sailors go to aircraft carriers and where they have 5,000 people and they may see their captain one time who's an 06 or an admiral even. And so I think it was a great experience for me personally. But you just have to remember when you're on the work side, I mean, we're always at work in that sense when you're underwater for 6 months, but it really, remembering when you're back there in the plant and you're doing anything like mission critical, that you have that command structure is really important. But it's nice to be able to break it during meal times a little bit and just be people with each other.
Thank you. Major Scott?
So I certainly think there's a misconception of the whole enlisted officer divide. So now I can only speak to the Army, and I was also an enlisted soldier for 10 years. However, I would say that's not a thing. There's no divide. Granted, the officers are responsible for them planning, and our enlisted are responsible for the execution of those plans. But typically, even in the planning process, it's a team effort, right? Because the person who's executing, you want them to be a part of the plan. I think sometimes the misconception is that, because officers come in with the degree, they're more of the white collar, and enlisted is maybe considered the blue collar. But I'm here to tell you that is certainly a misconception. I want to squash right here. I'm currently in the Army Acquisition Corps, and in this profession, the enlisted are more experienced and they are highly educated. So typically, as an officer coming in this career field, they're going to be teaching you. So don't think there's any type of divide, and please don't think that you're better than anybody because you're an officer. Now, granted, I understand every field is different, but I've personally had the pleasure of working with some top-notch enlisted soldiers. There's no divide. No one's better than the other, and it's a team effort. And as we discussed earlier, I get it. There is a chain of command. Your commanding officer is going to outrank the private on the ground. But at the end of the day, as long as you're a professional, the chain of command is not going to impede on building a team and working together to get the mission done.
Thank you so much for sharing. Captain Hanefen?
Yeah, I guess the traditional notion isn't really being well represented, so I think I might actually do that. The American military system is based in origin in a class-based system, and it does perpetuate that class system. And to say that it doesn't, I don't think underlies, maybe underlies some bias. There's We are paid different rates. We have different career tracks. Officer housing is of a different quality than enlisted housing. What I am expected to do is of a different level. We literally write different laws. If a commander loses an object, they are fully responsible for the full price to the Army for that object. If an enlisted person loses an object, we actually have laws in place to protect them, I believe. And Sergeant Major Cleveland could probably advise me about the exact limitations, but I believe it's the equivalent of 1 month's paycheck and change, and over time. And so there are differences. You could generally think of the enlisted path as a little bit less risk, less reward, and the officer path is a little bit more high risk, high reward. But there are differences, and there is a divide. But that divide, I think, as we have an increasingly egalitarian society, is getting bridged more and more. And so really there's an open question, I think, as to whether or not the structure that we have in the military today is really reflective and appropriate of the society that we want to have and that we do have today.
Thank you. Sergeant Shaw?
Yeah, and all great points across the board. I think due to customs and traditions, that creates the divide, right? It's there on purpose, and so therefore it does in fact exist. However, I would say also along those lines, as you progress in your career, and you get to a command sergeant major level where you're a senior enlisted, where you're directly interacting with an 03 and 04 and 05 and beyond, that's where that relationship starts to build upon, and those gaps are bridged a little bit. I would say the junior ranks, junior enlisted, junior officer is where that divide is most prevalent, right? And going back to what Major Scott was talking about, the have versus the have-nots, right? The educated versus the uneducated, enlisted being perceived as the rocks, the grunts, the people that are out there on the ground doing the work, where the junior officers are the ones out there barking the commands to make it happen. And they're coming in with their shiny, polished educations more often than not, versus the uneducated enlisted, right? Or at least that's what's being perceived. As time progresses and moves forward, though, and I know that we're going to get into education here in a bit, that also is being erased, or at least lessened, or more of a gray area as well. So yes, there's a divide. That's again on purpose. However, as Captain Hanefen just pointed out, as time goes on and there's more of an organizational, from an outside perspective, approach that's being implemented and reevaluating and evaluating again, and then reevaluating again after that on how we do and what we do and why we do, that bridge is certainly being built little by little.
Thank you. So speaking of the education, the military places strong emphasis on both military and civilian education. Describe an experience in which education and or training made a significant difference in your military life. We'll start with Senior Airman Briggs.
My very first experience with the military was informed through education. I had enlisted in the Air Guard to help support my undergraduate education, and had already taken some preliminary education courses before entering Air Force BMT. And when my TI discovered that I was an education major, I was tasked with ensuring that every member of our flight passed our exam to be able to exit BMT, and held me directly responsible to ensure that everyone did so. But it was really very helpful for me to be able to start to really learn the dynamics of being responsible within the framework of a team, and being able to deploy real person-centered education and meeting learners where they're at, to be able to help support them in a really vital function, so that we were all able to succeed as a team, which we were able to do so. So that was really, right from the outset, education informed, had a very significant impact on my experience in the military.
Thank you. Sergeant Shaw?
Yeah, this is one that I've certainly come full circle on in life. Starting off a pathway that wanted little to nothing to do with education, and that primarily was one of the reasons of exploring the military as an opportunity. But shortly after getting into the military in that environment, training was everything. And taking that a step further and getting back into education as a way to not only enhance what I'm capable of, my thoughts, my processes, my strategies related to the military setting, but thinking big picture about how is this going to be implemented and how is this going to affect me long term once I am back in the civilian world. And so as I introduce myself, now a huge advocate for the world of education, and see it as a must for all service members. And so for those that are out there and are serving, will serve, take advantage of those opportunities, because while in early on, at least, it was something that I certainly scoffed at and pushed to the side, only to later realize in life, wow, this is amazing. It opens your mind to different approaches, different problem solving tactics. And this comes from being exposed to different people. Right. And so I think that's the greatest thing about education, is it opens doors and introduces you to other people, that think differently, that act differently, that do differently. And then going back to the training piece, same thing. If you have an opportunity to go to a specialized school to take advantage and learn a new skill that is only going to make you a better service member, but also a better person, then 100% take advantage of that. We can't change the past, but we can certainly take advantage of where we're at now to create a different ending.
Thank you. Captain Hanefen?
Yeah, so I think the military is super centered on education right now. I know in my short career, we've seen, tuition assistance go from being you use it later, which is how a lot of, especially enlisted members, get their education while serving, has gone from this extra thing you do to essentially you in process as a soldier and you immediately try to get them enrolled in college classes. And we've had policy adjustments in order to allow that to happen. I'll say in my own experience as a history major from SUNY New Paltz, that's something that in a lot of other professions might not have been as central, but here in the military is absolutely. Just this weekend, I led a bunch of cadets on a staff ride of Gettysburg, which was quite the road trip. But that I was using these skills of a liberal arts education that were absolutely key, and I was able to do a lot of analysis of primary documents, evaluation skills that I learned from my various professors at SUNY New Paltz, and I think that there's just very few professions that allow you to have to utilize the breadth of skills compared to the military. It absolutely centers that. And then on the flip side, the Army kicks you out and says, here's your, doesn't kick you out, but leaves, lets you walk away or walk into a different sense. Use your GI Bill. In my case, go get a law degree. So I think that you're going to find very few organizations that value education as much as the military does, which is, I think, ironic considering the reputation that I believe Sergeant Shaw gave initially.
Thank you. I'm hoping that we can break a lot of these misconceptions throughout this entire process. Speaking of which, most civilians have an image of what it would like to be a service member, thanks to Hollywood, video games, the media, etc. What are the common misconceptions people have about the military experience? And how can we address these misconceptions and communicate the realities more effectively? Major Khan?
Hey, thanks. I think I'll address two misconceptions that I was thinking of over the weekend. And I'll give you real rough numbers. Obviously, you can fact check me. It's all open source. But, not every soldier is a combat soldier. And again, I'm speaking for the Army, and I believe it's very similar across the joint forces. But not every soldier is an actual combat soldier like you'd see in Hollywood movies. For context, I think there's about 500,000 soldiers in the Army today, active duty. And we probably have somewhere around 40 brigade combat teams, which are, the core fighting force of the Army. And a brigade combat team is made up of around 3,500 soldiers. So of that, probably 50% to 60% of those are actual combat soldiers. So it's actually the majority of soldiers that we have in the Army are there to support the fighting force and to support not only combat operations, but humanitarian operations and other operations around the globe. So that's one. And again, not every combat soldier is constantly or often engaged in combat at that. And so that's the one thing that I'll say. I think the military does so many great things. Humanitarian missions, hurricane response. We're at the forefront of the COVID-19 vaccine. I mean, I'm pretty sure everyone's heard of Operation Warp Speed. Ebola. We had so many officers and organizations. My wife was assigned to a combat support hospital a couple of times, and they've done just great things that you know, Army medicine just really moves the ball forward for a lot of things. And so it's not just this, you know, a bunch of soldiers that are just looking for combat operations.
Thank you. Command Sergeant Major Cleveland.
I think Major Khan hit it the nail on the head there. It's really not. We have this tendency to think everything about the military is combat, because I think that's how Hollywood portrays it, and that's what the video games focus on. But how exciting would a video game be if it focused on giving vaccines to goats, handing out soccer balls to kids, things like that. So I think the majority of the time that we spend in the military, we spend really training to build our proficiency in the event that we do have to go to combat. But I think the likelihood of us actually seeing combat versus all of those support functions, even for our combat armed soldiers in a deployed situation, a lot of them, as Major Khan mentioned, they spend a lot of time doing more humanitarian type efforts, training other countries' militaries so that they can address issues internally. And the other thing I think is, you know, if you ask a soldier or a service member if they want to go to war, well, I think the vast majority of people don't want to go to war. We do a lot to help our country try to avoid combat. And that's something I think a lot of people just don't realize because of the way things are portrayed in Hollywood. The other thing is, someone earlier mentioned those family relationships. What a lot of people don't realize is how much the family is integrated into our lives as service members, and how much the military does to take care of families as well. If you ever have the opportunity to be on a military installation, a larger one, you'll see that that military installation has a lot of the same things that a normal town has. We have childcare centers, we have elementary schools, high schools. You know, football on a military base for kids is just as big as the homecoming game out in town is each year. Libraries, hospitals, all those same things exist, and trying to make sure our families are taken care of so that in the event that we do have to leave, we don't have to worry about how our families are while we're gone.
Thank you. I'm going to stick with the same branch. So Corporal James.
I think one thing that for me that kind of resonates that a lot of people don't realize is how progressive sometimes the military as an institution as a whole can be. You'll have basically a lot of times people have this idealized version of what a soldier actually is, and they don't realize that the armed forces are a very highly diversified and equality kind of based system. From my own personal experience, I want to mention, going back to the education, my education experience. I came into the Army for loan repayment. I had a college degree in chemistry from Fordham University. I heard some people talking about the cadets. So I wanted a quick way to repay my loans. At the same time, when I entered into my battery, I had two totally opposite experiences with that. For the majority of the time, it was like people said that, oh, you're educated, you get more responsibilities, more jobs. I got a chance to go to armor school. I also assisted our NBC and CO, basically, because I had a chemistry degree. And I also kind of got to interact with others. But at the same time, I remember being with second platoon, and then it was kind of adverse, is a good way to put it, reaction of me having a college education, and I was kind of being blocked for a little bit about getting certain access and opportunities, like going up to basically a promotion board. My platoon or my squad leader at the time kind of had a personal dig that I was college educated and going for loan repayment. So again, a lot of times he would kind of undercut me out for promotion boards. That kind of changed later on when I went with a different platoon and got to talk to the commanding officer in an open door policy about it. But again, like I said, it's about equality and basically a lot of civil rights kind of issues that the military kind of upholds, and even more I find in our own personal society. Like there's more change or opportunities to deal with issues than in regular society sometimes with things. And people take it more serious in the military, from my experience. I can't say for everyone, but my experience.
Thank you. From the Navy side, first class, petty officer, first class Freeze Bogart.
So I like a lot of the points that everybody addressed. Some of the other common misconceptions I think come from like the flashy Hollywood side, where you have, if anybody's seen Battleship, Rihanna, where she is an actress playing a Navy sailor who has 17,000 jobs and she does all of them perfectly. I think one thing you get, especially on the enlisted side, is you get very specialized in your own lane. So for myself, like a nuclear electrician, I was very like electrical maintenance and plant operation, and then everybody cleans on a submarine and everybody's involved in a submarine for damage control. So if a fire breaks out, everybody's responsible, and things like that. Where I think on a Hollywood side, you have a big misconception of exactly what a job is in the military. And then just some obviously funny ones about submarines. I don't know if anybody's seen Fast and the Furious 8, where they drove a submarine from a tablet in a plane miles and miles away, or Hunter Killer, where you just have a heavy focus on the forward part of the boat also, where your sonar, and submarines don't have windows, just in case anybody was wondering. And then also really how important the engineering side of the boat is, and they just never talk about it. So it's just interesting, because I think a lot of people don't think of the engineering side as like a career path when they're going through college, and as an engineering that can go into submarines as an officer and really do a world of good.
Thank you. So a lot of you brought up that one of the common misconceptions has to do with combat. So I think it is a good idea that we sort of address combat, since there are so many misconceptions around it. So in combat situations, the most challenging and often overlooked part of a service member's job is taking lives. How do service members deal with pulling the trigger? Major Khan?
Thanks. So yeah, I would agree with you that that is probably the most challenging aspect of being a combat soldier. And oftentimes these are very young men and women. So what do we do, and how do we address that? Really, before anyone enters a combat situation in a combat operation, there's very specific rules of engagement, and I don't want to say that it's completely controlled by lawyers and how that goes, but really it is, right? So we need to ensure that everything that you do is within those rules of engagement that are clearly vetted in the international community. And typically it's in self-defense, in defense of a fellow service member, or in defense of innocent civilians. So it's important that we realize that, the fact having a rogue soldier is very rare. And really oftentimes they're just, not oftentimes, all the time, it's operating within the rules of engagement.
Command Sergeant Major Cleveland.
Sure. So I can tell you for myself, I consider myself fortunate that I have never been in a situation where I have had to pull the trigger. But but I am married to a fellow soldier who is combat arms. And I can tell you that is one of the hardest things he lives with on a day-to-day basis. He's spent more time in combat than I have, and he hasn't been as fortunate. I've also led soldiers who have had to deal with the emotional and psychological wounds that come with taking another life. And so I think one of the biggest things that the Army does, and I think all of the services do this, is an emphasis on resilience. So we really try to teach our service members and reinforce within our service members the idea of resilience and understanding that at times the profession we've chosen may ask us to make difficult decisions that most people don't ever have to face. And how do we move forward from those decisions to understand that the decision to take another life wasn't taken lightly, wasn't made lightly, and that it was in the interest of saving more lives. And I think that's how we move forward with it. But we really have to emphasize that resilience across the board in order to successfully move forward.
Thank you. Sergeant Shaw.
Yeah, and what a great topic to talk about, to start to break down some of those barriers that we were referring to earlier amongst the general public. And I think this is a particular area where maybe more so than others, the Marine Corps is simply different. I mentioned earlier that ground electronics maintenance was the job that I was assigned to do. But upon arriving in Iraq twice, did very little, if any, of that. And that's simply because every Marine is first and foremost trained to be a rifleman. And as a result, the training positions you to understand that you are facing a faceless enemy. And so pulling the trigger, the physical action of pulling the trigger is not difficult. It's one that comes naturally based on consistent training time after time after time. So you're doing it almost blindly, but still with proficient accuracy. And so to do as minimal harm as possible. And this all goes back to what Major Khan was talking about in terms of rules of engagement. There's a time and a place, there's a reason behind it, and it's all situational dependent. So again, I'd like to emphasize that, Marine Corps specific, in my personal experience specific, the action of pulling the trigger, not difficult. It's what Command Sergeant Major Cleveland was talking about in terms of dealing with it, the aftermath. And I know we're going to get into PTSD here in a second, but that's going to look very different for different folks, right? And it's again, I want to emphasize the aftermath, and that could be an hour, a day, a week, a month, a year. It's all case by case depending on the specific service member, but training positions you to do exactly that. The military is a voluntary force, and my time spent specifically was during the height of being in Iraq and Afghanistan when combat was heavy. And so when I signed on the dotted line and I raised my right hand, I knew that was a very real possibility. And I was mentally, you can't ever be 100% prepared for that, right? Just, you can't until you're there living it. But due to the training that I received, due to the experiences that I had leading up to that, and the resilience that we were talking about, and the mental support that you receive from the service branches in terms of what to do, how to do, when to do, helped me along the way, I guess.
Thank you. Corporal James.
I guess I'll touch on what I saw. Just like the sergeant, the Marine sergeant was saying, I was basically in Iraq 2003 to 2004 into crit. And I guess the most interesting part I'd like to say about my military experience, I kind of felt that I was in a catch-up period for when soldiers were coming back from Iraq, because in my platoon, a lot of individuals had mental health issues, and they wind up, instead of like trying to go through the normal channels of talking to your commander or your squad leader and then going to get mental health. They kind of took the route of, I'm just going to kind of use drugs and substance abuse again. So basically I had a battery of 150 people. And I think right when we came back from Iraq, I say at least a good like 57 to 60 people got chaptered out for drug and alcohol abuse, basically from that. And with my own experience or mental health visits and stuff in the military, I know that there was a lot of pressure. Maybe it was because we were combat arms of not going to seek that it was kind of seen as a sign of weakness. But I know that's changed now from talking to my other friends that are still in the military, how there's been a shift. But usually during that kind of point, it seemed like that the Army was trying to play catch up because they didn't really know how to do. You had kind of like, let's say a pre kind of like after Vietnam kind of mentality. And then you have kind of like a more progressive millennial. I was kind of caught in the middle of that kind of transition. And I think that's what is important that I've heard a lot of changes now, is that a lot of support for soldiers coming back from different deployments, getting mental health evaluations, and also services more available. And it's not the stigma that it once was when I was there. And I think that's an improvement I want to talk about.
Thank you. I think you all have sort of alluded to this, but I think one of the most important questions we're going to address today, especially on the civilian front and helping us to understand this is, what do we need to know or understand about PTSD, and how can we support those who suffer from it? Sorry, let's start with Major Khan again.
Yeah, so, PTSD, I don't think that it's something that's unique to military service members. Obviously, anyone that experiences any sort of traumatic event can experience PTSD. The military does do a pretty good job. I'll say, to talk about what Corporal James was just saying, things have changed significantly over time. Obviously, with 20 years in combat in a big institution like the United States Army or United States military in general, we start to adjust and adapt our techniques, right? So my first deployment was to Iraq as an infantryman. And we left in late 2004, and I was there for a year. That was my first time. By the time my second and third deployments to Afghanistan, things had changed, right? So we start to get screened. They do a pretty good job of recognizing and addressing things and screening folks prior to deployment, post-deployment, and then annually at our health assessments to see how things are going. You're talking to a healthcare provider, and to make sure that nothing's gone completely changed with the person. How can you support them? I guess, offer support just the way that you'd support any other family or friend, understanding, compassion, and just, time to heal.
Thank you. Command Sergeant Major Cleveland.
Yeah, I think Major Khan is spot on. And I think Corporal James brought up some good points. So my first deployment to Afghanistan was 2004, 2005. And I remember coming home from that deployment, and I went straight into a 4-day pass to get used to being back in the States again. Fast forward to 2011, 2012, and I came home from that deployment, and it wasn't straight into a pass. It was straight into 7 half days of reintegration, where they'd realized throughout that time frame that bringing us straight home from a combat environment and just throwing us to the wolves, essentially, when we've been away, haven't had to decide even what kind of cereal we wanted to buy at the store, let alone all of the other things that are different about coming home. So that reintegration process, as frustrating as it could be, it was so critical to getting us home and helping us identify where were we having challenges. And full transparency. So following my third deployment, I mentioned earlier, I never had to pull the trigger, but I did have to send my soldiers home in transfer cases. my last deployment I was on, I lost one of my soldiers. And on that particular deployment, I was also serving as what's called the ramp ceremony, NCOIC. So I was responsible for every service member, civilian, you name it, associated with the coalition in Afghanistan in Regional Command East. I was responsible for putting them on an airplane and sending them back home to their families for burial. And I came home from that deployment a completely different person. And I was so out of touch with my faith, my spirituality, my friends. I didn't know how to reconnect. And I'll never forget going to a counselor for the first time, really committed to that process, and being told I had PTSD. And I looked at him and said, I can't have PTSD. I'm not a combat arms soldier. I never had to pull the trigger. I have all these friends who've been in much worse situations than me. There's no way I have PTSD. You don't know what you're talking about. And over time, sticking with that counseling, which isn't easy to do. And I think anyone who's been through that process will tell you that's one of the hardest things they have to do, is actually stick with the counseling. The other hard part is recognizing that stuff doesn't go away. It's always there, right? It's learning coping skills to be able to deal with it. And it's being able to self-assess and recognize, okay, maybe something's going on in my life that's stressing me out right now, but I'm starting to see some of my symptoms resurface, and I need to touch back in with a counselor to do some self-care, or I need to touch back in with a spiritual advisor to do some self-care. In terms of support, I agree wholeheartedly with Major Khan. It's recognizing just being there for someone, being willing to listen, not passing judgment, and most importantly, I think knowing your friends who have PTSD and encouraging them, being there for them if they need someone to go with them to see a counselor, if they need someone to call and make that appointment for them. Sometimes people don't want to see it for themselves. They need their friends and family to have the courage to step up and say, hey, I think you need to talk to someone.
Thank you. Sergeant Shaw.
Yeah, great points across the board thus far. And I think the theme that's developing here between Major Khan and Command Sergeant Major Cleveland is, this isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, right? Everybody's gonna have a different experience, and everybody's gonna have their way of dealing with it, whatever that may be. And I would say that, yes, PTSD is not, limited to just service members. As Major Khan pointed out, it's all encompassing. I think the main difference there, though, is for service members, especially those that participated during a time of heavy combat, let's say between 04 and the tail end of 12, 13, 14, somewhere in that range, it was life. And certainly that was the case for me. It was the consistent day in, day out. You're leaving the wire, you're putting your life on the line, you're potentially having to defend yourself and those around you against the enemy. And so that what Command Sergeant Major Cleveland talked about, the reintegration, that was a key component to being able to successfully navigate PTSD after the fact. I can remember after my first deployment, returning back to Southern California and looking at the shoulder of the road for IEDs everywhere that I drove, being at a stoplight and being overly aware and overly vigilant about what's going on around me, to the point that it started to scare people, right? And that's a minor thing in my eyes compared to what a lot of other folks are dealing with. And that's what I mean. It's case by case. And so when talking about supporting and helping and doing what you can for those folks that have PTSD in your lives, the other theme that came out of the first two comments, I think, is communication, right? And Major Khan pointed out, give time, give space, allow for healing to take place, but become an expert in listening, right? Communication, I think, is at the top of skills in terms of leadership, in terms of a lot of things in life. But, if I have to put a percentage on it, being a good communicator means that you're overly heavy on the side of being a good listener, right? And that means that you know when to speak and how and what you're going to say in that moment. But more importantly, you're basing that off of what that person just told you. Now, on the flip side of that, I've never been around a group of people that simply don't want to be helped, and that's the hard part, right? Is we're all taught to be alpha in the sense that we can push through and put a brick wall in front of us, and we're going to find a way through it, over it, around it, whatever the case may be. But we're going to do it mostly on our own. And I'm talking in the sense of the aftermath with PTSD, right? And so I think that a lot of changes have been made, and changes for the better. The fact that we're talking about it right now means that it's a topic of conversation across the board. And that's a good thing. Whereas early on in my career, it was put that in a box, bury it deep down, and forget it even exists, right? And that's certainly not the way to handle it. That's what leads to taking the path of least resistance in the drugs and the alcohol, to forget and to kind of wipe that from your memory. But again, I can think the key here is to understand that it's case by case, and there's different triggers for each folks. It could be an image, it could be a smell, it could be a sound, and it could happen any place, any time. But understanding that that's what's taking place with that person, and offering an ear to listen to, or even a shoulder, whatever it may be that person needs, but just being there to openly communicate with that person, I think is absolutely key.
Thank you. Corporal James.
To piggyback off of what everyone was saying, we're dealing with my own issues with PTSD. I think the other part that comes in is trying to explain it to other people or situations. A lot of soldiers, a lot of times, have situations where people always ask them kind of what happened and issues. And to say that to a person that's never been really involved in the military, or kind of in a combat or kind of physical event or altercation like that, comes off really hard. It kind of makes you feel like part of you has changed. You don't kind of feel worthy of certain things, or you kind of have, with some people, at least myself I'm speaking of, that you have guilt about issues from the past. And the most important thing too is to realize, just trying to get used to the language we're talking of PTSD to other people. I remember with my wife currently now, of growing up and talking to her, and I would stare off at something, and I would kind of get ashamed or embarrassed to say, what happened? Oh, I had what they call an intrusive memory lapse because I saw something or smelled something. And it's just dealing with a lot of the stigma of being a soldier, sailor, airman, whoever, of trying to integrate back in society with these kind of feelings or these type of reactions to it. It almost makes you feel like that you're kind of removed in this kind of unique subculture. I remember, like, you have these experiences and you come back to your daily life or the average American life, and this part seems surreal compared to it, that it just seems kind of fake. And the issue that a lot of people have is trying to make that connection, or trying to rekindle that kind of bonds that you once missed. And people do different things. Some people join church groups, some people like to talk to a therapist. But the worst, like the sergeant said, are the ones that try to internalize it, and that leads to drug, alcohol abuse, and all sorts of other horrendous things. But it's based off of just like a slow step process. It's kind of learning to grieve over the self that you lost. But that's just my experience.
Thank you all so much for sharing your experiences. Speaking of those relationships, we often hear phrases like brotherhood and sisterhood when referring to the military. How would you describe the relationship between service members in the same military unit? Major Scott?
Oh my God. So your unit is your family. Quite frankly, I'm sure many of you out there are going to agree with this statement. You may spend more time with your unit than you do with your immediate family. I mean, think about it. We're coming in to do, physical training, PT at 6:30, and you probably not going to leave to go back home to about 1800. And then that 30-minute commute, or if you live on post, thank God, you might have about 5 minutes. But we spend a lot of time together. So, and I think that's what makes Army units so special. Like, we literally do everything together, and I'm talking about good and bad, which definitely builds the team. The people on your unit, quite frankly, become like lifelong friends. I remember my commander, when I was stationed out at Fort Carson, I was at Peterson Air Force Base. I was at the Air Force Base. I was in Army Space Command in Colorado Springs. And our commander would take the entire unit, because we were pretty small. We would go hiking up Pikes Peak together. We went skiing together. He would take us to basketball games to see the Denver Nuggets. And so when you do stuff like that with the same people all the time, I mean, you just can imagine what the camaraderie was like in that unit. I mean, just amazing. And so I think that's why you always hear, the saying for military, it's a brother and sisterhood, because you truly become a family.
Senior Airman Briggs.
So as a citizen airman, I have a slightly different perspective on it, because it was really very much a part-time vocation for me as I was going through school full-time. But even in the context of my life, it's a very small slice of my life. The intensity of those connections are unlike any other connections that I have had. I think about my training instructor in particular when I was at Lackland Air Force Base. His name was Staff Sergeant David Prock, and I only knew Sergeant Prock for 7 weeks, but yet even 20 years later, I still think about him and his impact and his influence on me every single day. Still one of the most impressive individuals I've ever encountered in my life, and I'm grateful for his impact and influence on my life.
Thank you. Corporal James.
I think it goes both hand in hand. Usually I have some intense feelings with other people, like they're just like family members with some of the people I served with in Iraq. And then also at the same time, I have people that I absolutely can't stand and never want to see again in my life. I guess it kind of amplifies that, because you go through all these kind of different situations. And it just depends on the unit cohesiveness. And my main point that probably makes the difference is by having extremely or good leadership involved in, let's say, at the platoon or battery level, as opposed to bad leadership. I've been in probably 3 platoons in the course of my military service. 2 of them were excellent NCOs. We were brotherhood. We would go out, do things together, have barbecues outside after our normal, and it felt like a family. One platoon, it was the exact opposite. I felt like I was basically in a living hell. And it kind of made my decision not to re-enlist after being in that platoon, because it was just an interesting time. But again, it just amplifies just extreme kind of things, especially. And especially, I could say, even after coming back after Iraq, it was kind of a closer bond, because you knew that people were risking their lives there for you, and you were doing the same thing, watching each other's back. So it kind of, I felt that more basically after we got back from the Iraq war in 2004. More that people that I kind of was a little apprehensive about in the military, I wound up being closer with them. I had different relationships even with my commanding officers, because we went through Iraq together in different situations. So it either gets intensely amplified or it goes in the other direction based off it, I could say, more than in the civilian.
Thank you for your honesty. So we're going to switch over a little bit, talking about intersecting identities. The armed forces are in the middle of a cultural self-appraisal as leaders try to improve opportunities for minorities and reduce institutional bias. What is your perspective on racial and ethnic divisions in the military? Major Scott?
So I feel like this question has been posed to me more often here lately due to the Army's Project Inclusion campaign and kind of everything that's going on in the news regarding diversity and equality. But me personally, I have not had any experiences with racial division, and I've been in predominantly combat armed units. So we're talking about brigade combat teams, infantry divisions, which are typically made up of white males. Granted, this is just my experience. Yet through this project inclusion discussions the Army's having throughout, every unit's kind of having this discussion. I've learned certainly that's not everyone else's experience. Some interesting stories have come out through these discussions. Yet I admit sometimes it is tough to see a chain of command board, right, where nobody on that board looks like you. There's no minorities, there's no females, and so you think hey, what's the future of the Army if nobody on that board looks like me, right? And so I think the Army is aware of that, and is investing in diversity, especially at the senior ranks levels, the 06 general officer levels, and they're certainly working on resolving those issues.
Thank you. Major Khan?
Thanks. Yeah, one of the most amazing things about the military is that it's just really a slice of the American pie, right? So, and really the world, because you don't have to necessarily just be an American citizen to join the U.S. military. So, I mean, you have people from all over the place. I'll tell you, I was born and raised in San Jose, California, to a family that's a certain economic class, and I can guarantee that pretty much everybody on this call, there's nobody that's exactly like me that was born in San Jose, California, from the certain exact economic class, right? But what we do is we come back into the Army, or we join the Army, or join the Air Force, or join whatever, and you're all the same all of a sudden. So I think the cool thing about it is that the Army does a really good job of creating a shared culture, and also recognizing the diversity in our ranks with cultural celebrations and meals and things like that. And we've seen really a huge shift over the last 10 years, really, with more and more women and minorities assuming key leadership roles. And I think it's great. Like Major Scott, it's when we talk about our own personal experiences of racial bias or racism in the military, it's so interesting. My name is Salim Ahmed Khan. And I don't know, I don't want to date all of these students here, right? But a lot of them may or may not really be able to recall 9/11. I joined the Army in 1998 as an infantryman, right after high school. So I was around during 9/11. And by September 12th, 2001, I was a member of the most feared and arguably hated class of people in the world, as an infantryman too. I never felt ostracized or mistreated by anyone in the Army. And I'd be hard pressed to say that that was the same, because I certainly felt shunning and racism from the community that I lived and grew up in, or not grew up in, but lived in at the time. So it's interesting. I hats off to the Army, and I, again, not sure how the other branches are, but I'm assuming it's relatively similar.
Thank you. Captain Hanefen?
Yeah. So the history of the United States Army and the history of racial relations in the United States are inextricably linked. I still remember in a lecture with Professor Coleman, who I believe is currently the chair of the Black Studies Department at SUNY New Paltz, him just getting up and saying, he's like, the United States Army has been the most integrationalist institution in the United States, full stop. And I think that we still hold that banner. However, we are still as Major Khan said, we are still a reflection of that society, and that society is a racist society. We self-organize. I, for example, am an AG officer. If you were to take the AG Corps out of the United States Army, especially the officer corps, you would lose most of its Black females. If you were to take the logistics corps out of the United States Army, you would lose most of its Black males. So we've seen, like Major Scott had seen or had stated, where do people like me or that look like me work within the military? and people follow that down. I was originally a field artillery officer, and talking about the command boards and the squadron that I served in, there was, the last few commanders and the command sergeant majors. All the commanders were white. All the command sergeant majors were black. And that was going back 10 years. I don't think that the Army had put that together intentionally, but that was as a result of sometimes self-selection, sometimes just that's what it looks like to me. And as a assistant professor in military science now, we really work hard to try to expose our cadets to a wide variety so that they can make a full choice. As far as colonels and generals, one of the big things to think about is it takes 25, 30 years to grow a colonel or general. So really, we are currently looking at the incoming class of, well, when I was born, 1989, coming in as those generals. So it is something that this is a big ship, and it takes a long time to turn. We're not quite as nimble as a submarine.
Thank you. I'm actually going to go ahead and skip to the next question given time. So beginning in January 2016, all military occupations and positions were open to women without exception. And President Biden recently signed an executive order repealing the transgender ban. Also in December 2010, President Obama signed a bill setting in motion the repeal of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. From your perspective, what gender discrepancies continue to exist, and what are the enduring challenges faced by LGBTQ plus service members? Commander Sergeant Major.
All right, so I can talk a little bit to the gender discrimination or gender discrepancies aspect of it. So coming up, I spent, I would say, a large portion of my formative years in the Army in combat arms units or around combat arms units. And oftentimes I was the only female in the organization. I can tell you as a first sergeant, I was initially the only female first sergeant in my battalion. And at one point I was the acting battalion command sergeant major for 3 months. And I remember going into the division command sergeant majors meetings at the 101st and being the only female in the room. And I will tell you one experience I had as a first sergeant, as a female first sergeant, and almost all of my subordinate platoon sergeants and squad leaders were males. I had an incident one time where one of my platoon sergeants disagreed with an action that the commander and I decided we were going to take to deal with a situation with a soldier. And I finally had to stop him. I was like, hey, that's enough. This is what we're going to do. It's not open for discussion. And he didn't talk to me for 24 hours. And I went up to him after the 24 hours and I said, hey, what's the deal? This isn't, we usually have a pretty good rapport. You're being very standoffish right now. What's going on? And he says, well, First Sergeant, you talked to me like I was a private. And I said, well, you were acting like a private in that moment, and we needed to move forward with the action. And he says, well, I've never had a female talk to me that way. And I said, well, have you had a first sergeant talk to you that way? Well, yes, First Sergeant. I said, then it doesn't matter that I'm a female, does it? It matters that I'm your first sergeant. And so that was 2015. And so things like that still exist. We still have, as Captain Hanefen mentioned, this is a big ship. It takes a long time to turn. So we just started the integration of females a couple years ago into those combat arms roles. And we're just now getting to where females are going to some of those more selective schools, some of those more physically challenging schools. And we're just getting females into some command positions where traditionally females haven't served before. And it's going to take us some time for soldiers to get used to that, for service members to get used to that. Now, I will say the Air Force, hats off to them because they've got a female command chief master sergeant of the Air Force right now. And I love watching what she is doing to change the dynamic of that type of senior leadership role. I think she is demonstrating how you know, we tend to look at females as a society, I think, as, oh, they're too emotional, is what people like to say. But I would offer that isn't emotion, that's compassion, that's empathy. And I think when we follow the teachings of people like Brene Brown, they teach us that compassion and empathy in leadership is critical to mission accomplishment. So I think we should be striving for that. And with that, I'll close it out on my comments because I can talk forever about it.
I do want to go ahead. I know it's 10:45, but especially since this is a major topic in my class, I wanted to go ahead and ask the same question of Petty Officer Fries-Bogart.
Yes, I think Stephanie brings up some amazing points. I'll touch on the gender thing real quick. Because I was on a submarine where it was 130 men, and they are integrating women into submarines slowly but surely, which I think is a great thing. It's definitely a culture shift, and a lot of people talk about it and have negative opinions and positive opinions. But I don't think there's anything that doesn't qualify a woman to be on a submarine compared to a man. So it's just a very interesting topic going on right now. To the LGBT side, openly gay male. I've been with my husband for 4.5 years, and I was openly gay my entire time in the service. I joined right before it got Don't Ask, Don't Tell got repealed, and then by the time I got to boot camp, it had already been repealed. And to see the military change over the last 9 years that I was in terms of that, and see people that had been in the military for 10 years already and were, closeted, and just the difference that it seemed to make instantaneously on their service was incredible. One of my most influential people was a senior chief when I was a student in the nuclear pipeline in 2012, and they ended up going, 25 years, I think, before they retired. And it just, if they had been, completely open in themselves before that, they would have lost their job. I know people that have lost or that were kicked out of the military because they signed a contract that said they wouldn't be openly gay, and then they came out or were outed by other people. And it's just a stressor that doesn't have to exist anymore. The military suicide rate's incredibly high as it is. And then LGBTQ plus community also has a higher suicide rate. So I think it's probably saved a lot of lives. I really didn't go through a lot of discrimination with it myself. It was odd when I first showed up to the command. There was one of 5 of us out of 130. And then by the time I left, I was the only one. So it is a little isolating, in an already isolating community. I don't feel like I was treated any different, which is great. I don't think it should stop anybody from wanting to join at all. I think it's a great perspective to bring to the service branches as well. That's all I got. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So unfortunately, we are out of time. We did have more questions, but the hope is actually, given the popularity of this, that we will have a second portion of this session. So the questions that we haven't gotten to today, hopefully many of you can join us next semester and continue this conversation. Thank you so much to the panelists for joining us today. I feel like we've gotten a lot of information out, and I feel like we are breaking a lot of those misconceptions.